The claim in the context of this lawsuit is that Big Food knowingly engineered ultra-processed foods to make them more addictive.
The government didn't really act to protect us until a series of state lawsuits were filed in the 1990s. So you're looking at minimum a 40-year gap from when it was obvious that this was dangerous to when the government actually did something. If you're waiting for the government to protect you from a potentially dangerous product, you're probably doing yourself a major disservice, and you're likely to be harmed by a dangerous product well before the government ever acts.
Listen, corporations put profit above everything, and history has demonstrated that time and time again.
There was an internal memo within a tobacco company that recognized for the first time that nicotine was an addictive substance, and they actually acknowledged that they were in the business of selling an addictive drug.
And they provided, they lied in the congressional hearing. That's what they did.
All right, welcome to Kern Case by Case, a Cohn Clark podcast with Bakersfield injury attorneys. I'm Matt Clark. This is our second episode. Today, we've got an interesting topic. We're going to unpack a new lawsuit that was filed by the city of San Francisco against what we're going to call Big Food. This is a lawsuit against some of the food brands you all know and love, things like Kraft Heinz, things like General Mills, things like Mars Candy, PepsiCo. All of them are in the lawsuit. It's a very interesting case. In order to break it down, we're going to bring in a special guest today. We're going to be chatting with a local dietitian. She's going to talk to us about ultra-processed foods, what they are, how they can impact our health, how dangerous are they? And the whole point of this is to, one, keep you all informed, and two, to talk about what we believe to be is a really interesting case. This is a case that closely parallels tobacco litigation that we probably have all heard about at some point in our lives. You know, this is a case that's particularly interesting here locally. As many of you know, Kern County and Bakersfield especially, we have problems with obesity in our community. We have problems with people who have poor health. If you look statistically, we have some of the poorest health in the state here in Bakersfield, California. And so we think it is a case that is relevant to our community, and we're going to break it down for you today. And today, we're talking about a case that was filed out of the city of San Francisco. Wait, what is that I hear, Chris?
A lot of boos from the folks in our community, right?
Hissing and booing because the case, no, this is a case that was filed out of the city of San Francisco, and it's a very interesting case, and it's one that we want to spend this entire podcast talking about. It's a case against what we'll call Big Food.
Big Food. Well, first of all, let's start out by saying, like, we don't have any position one way or the other, right, on the case. I think we just looked at it and thought, and we'll talk about this, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but considering the history and how we got to where we are with Big Food, it was just interesting to us to kind of look at it. And it's the first ever.
Yeah, I think yes, we need to make it very clear. We take no position on this case. We're no experts when it comes to food. I personally am no expert when it comes to healthy eating habits. In fact, I could use a lot of improvement in that regard. So what we want to do is just talk about the issues in the case because we think they're interesting, and we especially think they're interesting in light of some historical significance. And
right.
Just as a reminder, I'm Matt Clark. I'm the managing partner with the law offices of Cohn and Clark. Chris?
I'm Chris Hagan. I'm Matt's partner, one of the partners here at Cohn Clark.
So let's just start by talking about, in kind of a nutshell, the case, right? So we've got a lawsuit that has been filed by the attorney for the city of San Francisco, a guy by the name of David Chu. Mr. Chu is as I understand, a Harvard-educated lawyer. I believe he graduated from Harvard Law School in 1995. Late last year, so late 2025, he filed a lawsuit against a number of corporations, many of which are multinational corporations, that make up Big Food. And we'll describe what that is here in a minute. But what this really is, right, is it's a way for the law to try to control risk associated with what some people believe to be our dangerous products. that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement.
And you and I talked about this morning, actually. You know, we practice products liability law. In fact, we've litigated products liability cases here. We've sued the manufacturers of what we believe to be dangerous products, right? You think this is a traditional products liability case?
You know, it's interesting having that conversation today, and I think the answer is no, right? I mean, it does involve a product, right? We're talking about ultra-processed foods. That's the product. However, it's not a products liability, and it's not a products liability case in its traditional sense.
Right. Right. So let's make it clear. What we're talking about here is big food. They make foods that have now been classified as ultra processed foods. We call them UPFs. At least that's what they say in the industry. We're going to go through in time here and talk about what is the definition of an ultra processed food. How did this come about? Why are these things believed to be dangerous? You know, how is it impacting communities? But I think before we get there, you're correct. This is not a traditional products liability case. But if you think of products liability case law and products liability, statutory law, the purpose of those things is to protect a consumer from an unsafe product, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, although this is not a case founded in strict products liability, which is something that you and I deal with, it is in fact a case that's trying to protect consumers from a product that many scientists and dietitians and doctors believe to be dangerous. Think that's right?
I think that's fair.
So I'm going to ask you the first question then, right? Isn't it the government's responsibility to protect us as consumers from an unsafe product? Isn't that what the government's supposed to do?
Typically, right. Typically, it is the government's responsibility. But can't you argue that isn't that what the government's doing here? Because it is the government. It's the city of San Francisco that's filed the lawsuit against, a dozen or so big food companies.
True. But the way I'm thinking of it is in terms of the FDA, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the Food and Drug Administration at the federal government, as best I can tell, it's their job to protect us from ingesting, eating, taking drugs, whatever it may be, things that are unhealthy or bad for us. And it's their job to prevent us from being sold these products.
But
Right?
look historically at what's happened in the context of cases similar to this, and it's not the government that's pursued the claims in order to protect the consumer and the people. It's been a private action that's been filed, right?
Yeah.
So and we're going to talk about this a little bit in the tobacco cases. It wasn't the FDA pursuing the tobacco companies to protect the consumer, right? And then in connection with the opioid crisis, it wasn't the government going after the drug manufacturers in order to protect the public. Again, it was a private, it was a civil lawsuit that was filed against them in order to protect the public.
I think the tobacco cases are particularly interesting and have like eerie similarities to the case that's been filed out of the city of San Francisco. But before we get to tobacco, I think your point's well taken, right? It's like, hey, if we really just relied on the government to protect us from an unsafe product, well, it was fairly well established in the 1950s and certainly by the 1960s that tobacco was unsafe. It was addictive. I think there was a study, and we can talk about this, but like 96.5% of lung cancer patients, and this is in the 1950s, were found to have been moderate or heavy smokers. And yet the government didn't really act to protect us until a series of state lawsuits were filed in the 1990s. So you're looking at minimum a 40-year gap from when it was obvious that this was dangerous to when the government actually did something. I think asbestos is another good example of this, right? I mean, I did a little digging around. They knew asbestos was dangerous in the 1920s and early 30s. Like they knew it, hands down, okay? And yet it took OSHA until the 1970s, this is Fed OSHA, to really begin regulating the use of asbestos. So I think that that's just another example of if you're waiting for the government to protect you from a potentially dangerous product, you're probably doing yourself a major disservice, and you're likely to be harmed by a dangerous product well before the government ever acts.
I mean, don't we have that same issue here, right? I mean, it's been how many decades that people have known and that the scientific data has shown that these ultra-processed foods are dangerous and not good for you. but the government did nothing to step in to protect the end consumer and to protect the people.
In my mind, I started to draw some similarities, right? You look at smoking, you look at asbestos, right? And these were products that didn't have an instantaneous impact on human health, right? In other words, you're exposed to cigarette smoke, you're not going to be diagnosed with lung cancer tomorrow, okay? You're exposed to asbestos, you're not going to be diagnosed with mesothelioma tomorrow, right? These are products that took a great deal of exposure over time, and there was a latency in the onset of the symptoms. And I think that's very similar to what's happening with ultra-processed foods. At least that's a conclusion I drew in my head.
I mean, the way I looked at it was it almost took like an epidemic for something to be done about it, right?
Right, but I also think the fact that you can consume these foods, like, if I eat, and I'll probably end up using this example a lot because I like them, and that is the Oreo cookie, right? If I eat a sleeve of Oreo cookies, which I have been known to do at times, that's not going to just instantly make me sick. It might make my stomach hurt, but it's not going to instantly make me sick, right? I mean, one sleeve of Oreo cookies is not going to turn me into a type 2 diabetic.
Right, right.
But if I do that over and over and over and over again for a period of years, if you look at these studies at least, and you believe them, there is an increased likelihood I'm going to be a type 2 diabetic.
Yeah, the science supports it, right? I mean, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but I mean, some of the studies I looked at talked about the fact that they used to refer to it as adult onset diabetes. But they don't have it anymore because people are developing diabetes as a result of their eating habits at a much younger age. And in fact, all of the studies, well, not all of them, but the studies we were looking, or I was looking at, show the kids developing diabetes type 2 diabetes at a very, very, very young age.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it in the lawsuit itself, but they cite the studies that say, and these are older studies that go back to kind of the earlier 2000s, where if you look over time, since ultra-processed foods have really made it to market, the increase in childhood onset of type 2 diabetes has more than doubled, right? And so that's where they're really attributing it to these ultra-processed foods. All right, Chris, so the second question directed at you, right? I'm putting you on the spot here. I asked you, does the government have our interests at heart when protecting our health, right, from a dangerous product? How about corporations? What have you seen? Okay, I think I know.
Listen, we all know the answer to this question, and the answer is no. Listen, corporations put profit above everything, and history has demonstrated that time and time again. Again, we're going to talk about tobacco. We're going to talk about the ultra processed food business, and again, we've seen it here. The corporations are putting profit above health.
You telling me that corporate America is not most concerned about my health?
Yeah, they could care less about your health and mine.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't mean to be anti-corporate, right? In fact, I would point out that you and I are a corporation.
Yeah.
Okay? So I don't mean to be anti-corporate, but I think, as a consumer, right, if I'm concerned or if I have any concern whatsoever about making sure that I'm healthy, I don't think you trust what the corporation that's selling you the product is telling you about the product.
Right. I mean, read the labels.
Well, we're going to get into that, and when our guest gets here, we'll talk to her about it. I'm not even sure the labels are accurate all the time.
Well, not only are they accurate, but how does the end consumer, the everyday Joe, grab a box of whatever off the shelf and look at the ingredients and really, really understand what it is that they're putting into their body? Because they're assuming, look, it is on the shelf in the grocery store, right? That you mentioned earlier, FDA is out there to protect me. If it wasn't safe to eat, why would they be selling it at the grocery store?
Well, and that listen, we've seen this in the news a lot lately, especially, and I'm going to maybe say something here that a lot of people wouldn't expect me to say, but this case out of the city of San Francisco is weirdly aligned with I think we've coined it the MAHA movement, right? RFK Jr.'s plan to make Americans healthy again, right? And, he has really been out there beating the drum about these additives in foods, things like dyes and preservatives and the other chemicals that you can never pronounce that are on the label of these foods, right? And so there is kind of, you think city of San Francisco filing a lawsuit, You would think that the current administration would be totally, would disavow that at all costs. But I don't know that that's true here. I think in a weird way, they are aligned.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it would certainly align with RFK's agenda,
Yeah.
without a doubt.
And so that begs the question, right? And I think just so that we all understand this is a case filed by a lawyer for the city of San Francisco, right? But can this impact all Californians?
Yeah, because we're going to see we talked about this also. We're going to see the trickle down effect, right? Because if they achieve the desired outcome, we're going to talk about what they're after. It will perhaps cause change within the food industry. However, what I expect that we're going to see, and we saw this in the tobacco cases, is once this lawsuit gains traction, you're going to see similar cases filed in other states.
Yeah, 100%.
And whether that's by city attorneys or attorneys general, right, there will be other lawsuits in other states filed against big food companies.
And as I understand it, if the city of San Francisco is successful in this particular lawsuit and they were to get an injunction or some sort of a finding of liability, that would apply to the entirety of the state of California. The lawsuit is on behalf of the people of the state of California, not just the people of the city of San Francisco.
Right. In fact, you and I both, we have a copy of the 64-page lawsuit, and it says,
by the way, I don't know if people can see it on camera, but you and I may as well be brothers in the way that we independently flag and document a complaint.
Yeah, so the name of the plaintiff in the lawsuit is the people of the state of California acting by and through San Francisco City Attorney David Chu.
Yeah, so you mentioned just a second ago the tobacco lawsuits, okay? And I think it's important that for historical context, let's just take a minute and talk about the history of those lawsuits.
Should we talk about this lawsuit and what it is that they're claiming first? Am I getting ahead of where we want to go?
Sure. Because I do think it's relevant in the decision of the tobacco cases.
Yeah, right. So the claim in the context of this lawsuit is that Big Food knowingly engineered ultra-processed foods to make them more addictive, right? And use deceptive marketing practices, particularly to market the product to children in order to get the children addicted at a young age, thereby creating a public health crisis.
Correct. And there's two legal theories upon which they're pursuing this. One is a theory under the Business and Professions Code, basically that the big food industry is committing fraud, right, in misrepresenting their product.
Yeah, basically using deceptive business practices to sell their product.
The other legal theory, and I think it's quite interesting, we'll talk about it more towards the end, is they've filed a public nuisance claim, right? And so we'll talk about that. But what I find so interesting is the way that the industry, as well as the evolution of the science, and now this particular case mirrors that of the tobacco cases dating back into the 1950s. And so, just as a matter of history, right? It was in 1950 that an American scientist published a report that 96.5% of lung cancer patients were moderate to heavy smokers. In 1954, that was the first time a individual plaintiff sued one of the tobacco companies. A woman by the name of Eve Cooper sued R.J. Reynolds. She lost. Okay, she couldn't prove causation.
Right.
Causation is something that you and I talk about all the time. What is causation?
Yeah. So in the context of a negligence case, right, it's that the person's act caused the other individual harm. Was it a substantial factor? We could spend an hour talking about what that means. Was it a substantial factor in causing the person's harm?
Doesn't have to be the only factor.
It doesn't have to be the only factor, right? That's what the jury instruction says. But what's interesting about this case is, do they have to prove causation?
No,
they don't.
Not at least on the first cause of action.
Right.
Okay. So anyway, 1954, first lawsuit against one of the tobacco companies. 1963, this was discovered obviously many, many years later. There was an internal memo within a tobacco company that recognized for the first time that nicotine was an addictive substance. And they actually acknowledged that they were in the business of selling an addictive drug. Okay.
Can I actually read the quote? Because it's interesting. So it was R.J. Reynolds Company, and this was their manager of biochemical research. So I don't. Why does a cigarette company or tobacco company have biochemical researchers back in the
So
60s?
you might ask the same question about a food company.
Well,
by the
sure.
way, but go ahead.
And they all have them, right? And this is what they said. It is easy to characterize R.J. Reynolds merely as a tobacco company. In a broader and much less restrictive sense, however, R.J. Reynolds is in the flavor business.
Yeah, yeah. That's going to have some relevance when we get our guest on, because I have a lot of questions about that.
Well, hold on. Can I read the rest of it? He went on to say many flavorants for tobacco would be useful in food, beverage, and other products with large financial returns.
Yeah. Well, that gets back to, do corporations have our best health interests at heart? 1964, Surgeon General of the United States issues the first report citing health risks associated with smoking. I'm going to fast forward because 1964 all the way up till 1993. Basically nothing happens. Okay.
Right.
I mean, there's a little bit of regulation in regards to cigarette advertising. It was in the early 1970s that the law was passed that you could no longer advertise cigarettes on broadcast TV. There were a few other limitations put in place, but basically nothing. And by the way, statistically, about the same number of people smoked from the 1950s all the way up until the early 1990s. Okay. Despite all of this evidence that smoking was bad for you. And it wasn't until 1993, a paralegal working for a law firm, I believe in the city of Louisville, they were representing one of the major tobacco companies at the time, Brown and Williams. This paralegal, who I think was getting laid off, if I read the story correctly, she stole a bunch of documents, internal scientific documents from Brown and Williams that really laid the foundation for what was to quickly come thereafter. So right after that, you've got a scientist within Brown and Williams, a guy by the name of Jeffrey Wigand, who became a whistleblower. And really that was the beginning of, if you consider now the end, right? It was the beginning of the end for tobacco as we know it in the United States. In as soon as 1995, 1996, 1997, I believe all 50 states and 2 U.S. territories filed suit against all of the major tobacco companies. That ultimately culminated in a settlement. I wrote down the amount because it's pretty astounding. By June 1997, so remember, the paralegal stole the documents in 1993. The whistleblower comes out in 1994. By June of 1997, Big Tobacco said uncle and settled with the states for $368.5 billion, effectively putting them out of business to a great extent. Several of them went under. What I found interesting about that is as late as 1994, 7 of the Big Tobacco CEOs testified under oath before Congress that nicotine was not addictive.
Right. Despite the fact that they had all of the studies, right? And they knew that it was. And that was what some of the documentation showed that the paralegal had taken, right?
Correct.
And they provided, well, they lied in a congressional hearing is what they did.
100%. And so by 1997, right before they settled, okay, or right around the time they settled, these same CEOs, many of the same CEOs, were brought back before Congress where they modified their testimony. we can say redacted, modified, changed. I don't know what would be another good adjective for what they did. In any event, they now have come out and said, as of 1998, that nicotine is addictive and smoking may cause cancer.
Right.
Okay. So the legal theory in all those cases was the same, really, that the tobacco companies committed fraud and engaged in conspiracy to conceal and misrepresent the dangers associated with smoking.
Right.
I think that's an important background to the discussion of this new case against Big Food, because the legal theories are almost identical. Right.
Yeah, they're virtually the same.
Right.
I mean, the same arguments are going to get made on both sides of the coin, right?
100%. So with that said, we have a guest. I think we should bring her in. All right. So I brought with us today a guest, Nicole Giumarra. Nicole, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So in full disclosure, I've known you for a long time, at least 20 years now. You are married to one of my very, very good friends who I've known essentially my entire life. But that's not why we asked you to come on. We asked you to come on because you're an expert and you have some expertise that I think is particularly relevant to this case filed out of the city of San Francisco. You are a registered dietitian, right?
Yes.
What is that?
So a registered dietitian is somebody with an advanced degree in nutrition. Mine is a master's of science in nutrition sciences. And as a registered dietitian, I help educate patients, clients, individuals on evidence-based nutrition and eating patterns to manage, prevent chronic diseases.
And so how long have you been doing this?
Over 20 years.
And you are currently working with Bakersfield Family and Medical Care, as I understand it?
Medical group, yep.
Yeah. And you see patients on a daily basis,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And so how often, okay, here's a trick question. How often do you have to advise people as to their consumption of, and we're going to talk about this a lot, but as to their consumption of an ultra-processed food?
All the time.
Okay. So this is not a unique situation.
No.
Can you tell us what is an ultra-processed food?
Well, so there's varying degrees of processing, right? All food is processed to some degree in order to make it safe for consumption, right? So the minimally processed, like the packaged greens that you would buy in the grocery store that are ready to eat, like the spinach.
They've been washed.
They've been washed, right.
Okay.
Or say your canned diced tomatoes that you would add into a recipe. That would be a minimally processed food. They've been cooked and canned, right? Maybe a little bit of salt added to it. Your chicken breasts that you buy from the meat section, right? Those kinds of things are still processed foods. Ultra processed foods are sort of in a whole different category because I like to describe it as there's many steps between farm to fork in an ultra-processed food, right? There's a lot more steps. There's a lot more ingredients. And most of the time, those ingredients are not things that you would find in your home kitchen.
Right. These are things that have been cooked up by a scientist.
Right. These are industrial sweeteners, thickeners, stabilizers, emulsifiers, fats, protein isolates, those kinds of things that add flavor. They add thickness, stability. There's a purpose for these ultra-processed foods to some degree. They do, yes, they enhance flavor, but they actually improve shelf life. They can make food accessible to a lot more people. So there are some, pluses and minuses to these types of foods.
So the lawsuit we're talking about was filed against a number of defendants, right? We've been referring to that as big food, kind of like big tobacco. Is big food... Is that an actual phrase used in the industry?
We do use that occasionally, sure. Yeah.
So let's talk about it specifically, right?
Okay.
So Kraft Heinz, they're a defendant. Just as an example, these are the people that are making your Oscar Mayer hot dogs, your Kool-Aid, your Capri Suns, your Weight Watchers frozen meals, Jell-O, Philadelphia cream cheese, on and on and on, okay? Mondelez, I don't know if I pronounced that right. Mondelez, is that it? Okay. I'd never heard of these guys. So until I looked into this lawsuit, I guess they're a subsidiary or they were part of the Kraft group and they broke off. But anyway, that includes Nabisco, Oreo. I've been talking about those, my favorite. Ritz, I also like those. Triscuits, I like those. And Wheat Thins, man, these guys have got my number. Yeah, they've got my Fig Newtons we were talking about. So that's the kind of foods that they make. Post Holdings, we all know Post, the cereal company, includes things like Chips Ahoy and Cocoa Wheats and Golden Crisps, on and on and on. PepsiCo, right? PepsiCo is a huge processed food manufacturer, or UPF manufacturer, ultra processed food. Everything from their Frito-Lay brands, which would be things like Cheetos and my personal favorite, Doritos, on and on to all the Pepsi products, right? And then you've got General Mills, massive corporation. They do all the cereals, Chex Mix, things like Old El Paso, the salsa. I didn't realize that they did that. And so Yoplait yogurt. I read something interesting. Let me ask you a question. Is Yoplait good for you?
Well, just like everything in nutrition, Matt, it's very nuanced. There's a lot of gray area.
I want you to explain that.
It depends.
But I read something that suggested that Yoplait yogurt has within it, and they've formulated it as such, to have as much sugar as like an Oreo cookie.
Hmm. Okay.
And so, and the theory, and that's sort of mentioned in the lawsuit, is that they've increased that sugar content to make it more appealing and possibly more addicting. We'll talk about that too. But is that something that in kind of food science or in the world of nutrition, is that something that's recognized, that these companies are fudging their products' formulas to make them addictive?
Well, to be honest, I can't speak to the actual intention behind it, but
Well, you don't have the internal document.
exactly.
You got to get that paralegal that store the documents from the tobacco companies that they don't know, right?
But we know obviously things that are that have high sugar and are very sweet taste really good, and it makes you want to eat more of them. So that those are things that we try to watch out for and try to reduce our intake of. So
The other defendants are Nestle, Kellogg's, Mars, the candy bar company, ConAgra, which makes all kinds of stuff, everything from your Slim Jims to your Jiffy Pop to your
mhm.
Chef Boyardee. I don't know that I've had Chef Boyardee in a long time. That's true. That 100%. So one of the things that's cited in the lawsuit is to a study that was done by as I understand it, a Brazilian scientist named Carlos, probably going to butcher this poor guy's name, Monteiro, where he developed something called the Nova scale.
Right.
Are you familiar with that? Is that something that
Yeah.
in your industry you talk about?
So the Nova scale was kind of one of the first attempts to try to classify processed foods based on how much a food is processed and what they're processed with. I think it's a good start. It does sort of miss some of the nuances in nutrition. A lot of the minimally processed foods would be in that group 1, and then it kind of goes up from there to group 4 being those UPFs, those ultra processed foods with all those industrial ingredients.
And so it's the Nova Group 4 that we're really concerned with in this lawsuit.
That's what it sounds like to me. Yes, and I think most of us probably know when we see an ultra processed food, right? Doritos and Oreos and those really sugary cereals.
You mean the Doritos aren't covered with all natural flavoring?
Well, and even if they were, they'd still be ultra processed.
Good point. Good point. So in the lawsuit, they spend a great deal of time at the outset talking about a food industry insider, a guy by the name of Michael Mudd. I'm not going to quiz you on who that is, okay? But he was a vice president for Kraft. And in 1999, so 26, 27 years ago now, he, in front of his colleagues at some big food convention, I feel like this is like when the mafia would get together for their councils, but at some food convention, actually hosted by Pillsbury, if I read it right, he lost his job shortly after he made these comments. He talked about the devastating health consequences known within the industry when people consume too many UPFs, ultra-processed foods. He said that UPFs had caused childhood obesity rates to double, and that was as of 1999, so I can't imagine.
It's gone up since then.
Yes. That it was costing, and this is in 1999 dollars, $100 billion per year to treat health conditions in the United States caused by UPFs. Mind you, again, let's just so everybody's clear. This is the insider, right? Is saying that $100 billion per year to treat conditions caused by UPFs. And by his estimation, 300,000 Americans died each year based on consuming too many of these ultra-processed foods. I looked that up, by the way. That's close to the number of U.S. soldiers killed in World War II.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was over many years. This is over a year. And so he said, look, this is a public health crisis. We as an industry need to address this. He talked about the industry putting profits over people's health, and he was summarily lost his job shortly thereafter. And it doesn't appear that anything has changed in the last 27 years. What have you, that's about the period of time you've been in the industry. So what have you observed over that period of time?
Well, they're definitely, I have seen a much more higher proliferation of people consuming ultra-processed foods. Absolutely. Definitely more kids that their entire diet revolves around ultra-processed foods. Things like having a granola bar for breakfast and having some kind of, what are those Smuckers sandwiches? The
Truffles.
for lunch, and then, having a frozen pizza for dinner. So yeah, it definitely has increased, and seeing a lot more of it for sure.
Are you seeing in terms of patients, are you seeing more in the way of pediatric patients because of that?
I do see some. I see mostly adults, but I do see some kids, and a lot of kids, yes, are eating these foods.
Because one of the claims in the lawsuit is that the ultra-processed food manufacturers, the defendants in the lawsuit, are really unfairly targeting children with their
Sure.
advertisement campaigns.
Sure.
You know,
But kids don't buy their groceries.
this is a good point, right? But kids probably have some influence over the parent who is buying the groceries.
Most likely, yes.
And I don't play video games, but I read within the article, the lawsuit, as well as some of the documents cited to in the lawsuit, that they're going as far as putting product placement advertisements in video games for things like Go-Gurt, right? For things like Doritos,
Right.
and the various sugary beverages.
It's great advertising, right?
Right, exactly, because kids are glued to the video game.
Exactly.
And so, as from a public health perspective, are we seeing at the ground level an increase in things like childhood onset type 2 diabetes?
Yes. Type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol levels in kids.
High cholesterol in kids?
Yes. High blood pressure, fatty liver related to excess calorie intake, usually coming from ultra-processed foods.
And isn't fatty liver something that used to really just be associated with alcoholism?
Yes, but they actually have changed the definitions of how we classify fatty liver. We used to call it, if it was not related to alcohol intake, like because if somebody had maybe central adiposity around their internal organs, we would call it non-alcoholic fatty liver. Now we call it metabolic associated fatty liver because it is it's not related to alcohol intake. It is related to a metabolic issue from excess calorie intake, usually from excess sugar intake, ultra-processed foods.
And that can be fatal.
And
you can get cirrhosis and other
absolutely.
diseases from, okay.
Yeah, it's
And
not
you're
good.
seeing this in children.
Yes.
Okay. What about, so here, I think I know what your answer to this question is going to be. Are ultra-processed foods bad for us?
Well,
I'm not asking your opinion. I'm asking, as an industry, when it comes to nutrition science, is there a conclusion that these things, we really shouldn't be consuming these things?
there's a lot of gray area to this, right? So
Tell me about that.
So ultra-processed foods in general, they're not great for us. But in the context of a healthy diet with other things in mind, like somebody's budget, their access to food, their ability and time to prepare food and meals, ultra-processed foods can have a place in a healthy diet. That doesn't mean they should take up the majority of somebody's diet.
So it shouldn't be the example you just gave me where the kid has a granola bar for breakfast, a Uncrustable for lunch, and a frozen pizza for dessert.
No.
Okay, and every day.
Correct. It should not be that.
We know that. Do we know that that will lead to a negative health outcome?
Depending on that child's genetics, we can surmise that yes, it probably is not going to be great for their health.
In terms of like, as a lawyer, I'll speak as a lawyer since that's what I do once in a while. Is it more likely true than not that that's going to have a negative health impact on somebody if all you consume is these ultra-processed foods?
All you consume of those ultra-processed foods, you lead a sedentary lifestyle, it is more likely that it is going to cause health problems, yes.
Is there any, is there an opinion within the nutrition industry or nutrition science about the addictiveness of these foods? Because what the lawsuit is asserting, and I'm not claiming this is correct, okay, but what it's asserting is that these foods have been, I'll use the word fudged in their formulation to make them more desirable to people, to make it so that people want to consume more. There's, in fact, a study cited in the lawsuit that says these foods have been developed in such a way as to mask or cover up a person's sensation of being full, so they eat too many of them. Is that something that's accepted within the industry, like as true?
Yeah, because a lot of these foods, they're high in fats and sugars and salts, right? All of those things, fat, sugar, salt, all taste good, right? They are also very low.
Sounds like my lunch. Yeah.
Don't tell me what you ate.
Yeah, you would want to know.
And they're also, these foods are largely low in fiber. Fiber adds to satiety. So when these foods, they taste really good. Most of them, they're soft, they're easy to eat. They get broken down and digested and absorbed really fast. And so, yeah, the satiety factor really goes down. They're easy to eat a lot of. So yes, it's easy to overdo.
There's a study cited in the lawsuit where they had rats. Now we can all debate as a rat a proper well, I guess a lot of medications and other things are tested with rats to
Yeah.
begin with, but they put an ultra processed food with artificial sweetener on one side and methamphetamine on the other side, and the rats preferred the ultra processed food. And what they did is they made it such that if it got the ultra processed food, it would get an electric shock. So sort of hey, don't go do that. It would still go eat the ultra processed food with artificial sweeteners more than a methamphetamine. The authors of that study, of course, concluding that these foods can be addictive like a methamphetamine.
Yeah, I think the consensus on food addiction is there's not 100% consensus either way. That there's some evidence that some people may be more likely to become addicted to food, and there are even certain eating disorders where that food addiction is sort of part of that. But it is hard to be addicted to something that we need for survival, right? Usually with like a drug addiction, you would treat by having the person abstain from drugs or alcohol, right? You can't really abstain from food. Can we abstain from ultra processed foods? Yeah, potentially.
The parallel that I think they're trying to draw with this San Francisco case, when we compare it to the tobacco cases, is that addictive nature of the food, right? And they're trying to draw this parallel between nicotine and, be it artificial sweeteners, fats, salts, at a level that people find particularly appealing.
Right.
Okay? It sounds to me like, at least within your industry, there hasn't been a conclusion yet that, okay, this is just like nicotine, right? We haven't drawn that conclusion yet.
Not necessarily, because I think, like I said, there is a lot of nuance. And especially when I counsel patients, I have to take into account not just what they're eating, but why they're eating it. What goes into their food decisions or their food buying decisions. And that can be, their budget and their access. And of course, a lot of these foods, they are really cheap because a lot of those inputs are heavily subsidized by our government, corn and wheat and soy. So all these ultra processed foods are really cheap. And for a lot of people, that drives those buying decisions.
Yeah, I think I read that 70% of all food products in your average grocery store are manufactured by one of the defendants in this case.
Interesting, yeah.
That's an astounding figure when you really think
Yeah.
of it. So what does that leave? Just the fruit and vegetable aisle and the meat aisle, basically?
Right.
The aisle?
Which, to be fair, could be very expensive for some people when they're looking at, say, a bag of Doritos, which they may get more bang for their calorie buck, so to speak, than buying a bag of apples.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Let me follow up with this. One of the phrases that I see cited in the lawsuit is that big food, right? These defendants are putting into their product something that they call reinforcing agents. Okay, with the definition of a reinforcing agent being a flavor profile, could be a sweetness or a salty profile, that they have done in-depth studies to determine that this is what people will crave and make them buy more and more of it. Is that something that's accepted within the community, or is that something that's still up in the air?
I think that's something that's still up in the air. Of course, that sort of enhancer and making things taste really good. It goes back to the corporate profit driven market that we have in big food, right?
Right. It's better to have somebody eat a sleeve of Oreos in a sitting
Correct.
than two.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if we all practice moderation, Oreo sales are going to go down.
Well, that would be devastating to me, but probably be better for my health. So, and then lastly, and I think we kind of touched on this, but Is there evidence that big food is manufacturing these food products in such a way that it bypasses the signals our bodies send to us to tell us we're full? Because that's a big component of the case.
Yeah. So when we look at the ultra processed foods and what is in them, the sugar, the fat, the salt, we also have to look at what's not in them. Fiber, vitamins, minerals, for a lot of these foods, protein, fiber and protein make foods more satiating.
Meaning I feel full.
You feel full.
And I stop eating.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So without those things, without fiber, without protein, say in Doritos or Oreos, I'm sorry that I'm not trying to pick on those foods.
Yeah.
But without that, yeah, it is easy to overconsume.
I think somebody told me one time, it's like, okay, sit down and eat 4 eggs, okay? And then sit down and try to eat the same number of calories in something like Oreos and
Easy.
see what you're more full with.
Yeah.
And it's like, you will continue to eat those Oreos.
Right.
Where the 5th egg is probably unnecessary in most cases.
Sure. And it's that satiety factor. And yes, though, a lot of that sugar, salt, fat, it's hitting pleasure centers in our brain that drive us to want to eat. And then we have to think about the context in which we're eating these foods, right? Are we eating them with a nice, healthy, maybe a sandwich or a salad? Or are we eating them maybe while we're watching TV or while we're, doing some work, or we're not really paying attention to how much we're eating? And, before we know it, the sleeve of cookies is gone.
Yeah, well, I would just tell you personally, it's me standing at the kitchen counter, and you can't stop. I mean, I defy you. Eat one Oreo, you're a better person than I am. So to sum things up, it sounds like the claims made in this lawsuit have some basis in fact, but a lot of these things are still kind of up in the air.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we know that ultra-processed foods that are high in fats, particularly saturated fat, added sugars, added salts, are not good for our health in the long term when consumed in excess.
Okay. There was an interesting parallel also that was drawn between the tobacco cases and this ultra-processed food case, at least in my mind, okay? And that is that a lot of these ultra-processed food manufacturers really have their roots in being owned by the tobacco companies.
That is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, like R.J. Reynolds, they were the first one to get in the business. This is like in the 1960s, if I recall correctly. They bought Hawaiian Punch, okay? And it was around that time that they said, listen, we know flavor. Like, because we have all these flavor scientists that work on concocting our cigarettes, we know flavor. And so they quickly realized that they could profit in the food industry by being experts in flavor. So started with Hawaiian Punch. I think Kool-Aid came next. And then it was, Kraft was eventually bought by one of the big tobacco companies. And a lot of these processed food manufacturers were at one point in time owned by big tobacco. And I don't know. I find that interesting. From a nutrition standpoint, this concept of modifying flavor to make it more appealing. Okay, I know we've talked about salt, fat, sugar, right? But other flavors, by modifying those flavors to make them more appealing, is there any science in that area?
There is, and I think we can find research to show us many different conclusions. Artificial flavors, whether or not they increase that bliss point, so to speak, sure, they might, but I think the jury's still out on their impacts on health. I think we're looking more at the sugar, salt, fat contents because that is a little bit more conclusive as to the chronic disease risk.
What about artificial colors? Because that's been in the news a lot lately.
Yeah, that's pretty debated. The general consensus, at least among nutrition professionals, is that, of course, we find artificial colors in ultra-processed foods, right? If we take them out and replace them with plant-derived, or more naturally derived colors, it's still an ultra-processed food. It's not changing the nutritional profile with regard to the sugar, salt, and fat. There are some people, some children in particular, that might be more sensitive to those artificial colors and may have, behavior changes when they eat them. So, those individuals should avoid them. But generally speaking, getting rid of artificial colors is not really going to change the health profile of a food.
That's interesting because I was reading that, there's been a big debate over Skittles. In fact, I think I've even heard politicians directly talk about Skittles in the last couple of years and the various artificial colors they're using in Skittles. And one of the chemicals used, I guess, to have manufacture a Skittle is titanium dioxide. It's what makes the inside of the Skittle white, which allows them to apply the color coating over the top. And Mars Candy Corporation voluntarily pulled that out of the product for a very short period of time. Then they put it right back in.
Probably because sales went down.
Probably. And now they're pulling it out again. And I think the issue, if I understand correctly, is that the actual candy looks more dull in color and people don't want it.
They don't want it. And there have been attempts in the past by, I can't remember if it was Fruit Loops, changed their artificial colors, and they went to a more natural color. It was not as vibrant, a little more dull. Consumers didn't like it.
Yeah.
And so it's tricky because food manufacturers are responding to consumer demand to some degree.
I thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
We really appreciate it, and your expertise lends itself to us better understanding not just the lawsuit, but what processed foods are and how they impact our health. And so, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, Chris, Nicole, I think, interestingly enough, here we have a nutritionist, and she's not completely against ultra-processed food. I mean, I think that what I took from that is, yes, in excessive amounts, these things are bad for you.
It's like that old saying, right? All's good and everything's okay in moderation.
I kind of live by that.
So you can continue to have the Doritos.
And my Oreos, just not asleep. But I think the point in the lawsuit, to kind of bring this full circle, is that we're not, it's not about eating an ultra-processed food once in a while or even in moderation, right? It's about, at least the allegations and the complaint are, these products are made in such a way as to encourage people, addict people, to eat excessive amounts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And they tied it back to the tobacco company, right? And said that Big Food is using the exact same playbook that the tobacco companies used in order to create the addiction to tobacco products.
Yeah.
So that's what the lawsuit says.
So I think it's important. Let's just kind of sum this up if we can. Here are the claims in the case, right? The actual causes of action, meaning what are the bases upon which the lawsuit's been filed? The first is violation of unfair competition law, right?
Yeah, BMP Code Section 17200. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It goes on.
Yeah. And so the theory there is that the defendants in the case, these Big Food, as we've been calling them, used unfair, fraudulent, or deceptive practices that they knew the food they were selling is harmful to people, even as they claimed it was safe and healthy.
Right.
Period. Right. What makes that claim easy, and what I think is pretty brilliant on the city of San Francisco's part, is they do not have to prove causation, meaning they don't have to prove that consuming those foods caused some person or a population of people to develop a certain disease. Is that your read of it?
Yeah, I mean, right. They just have to demonstrate that they use these deceptive business practices to sell the product.
The second claim, public nuisance. Now, this is a little strange, right? I had to wrap my head around this one a little bit, because when we think of nuisance law, I always think of, my neighbor
has a dog that won't stop barking.
Well, there's the classic example, right? Or in a more public nuisance sense, somebody comes and builds an industrial plant next to a house, a neighborhood, and now the neighborhood's inundated with smells and odors and gases from this industrial plant. That's a public nuisance, right? And we've got a whole body of law that has developed around that. This is a little different. They're claiming that that the sale and the marketing of these ultra-processed foods is a nuisance to the people of the state of California.
Yeah, listen, I think it's creative, undoubtedly, and we talked about this before we got started. I kind of foresee that being the real challenge to their lawsuit. I think that particular cause of action is going to be a difficult one for the city. I think it will be attacked on and undergo scrutiny at the pleading stage, where they just attack the allegations in the complaint. Before there's any testimony, there's no witnesses who are going to testify. You just attack the complaint as a whole.
Well, and unlike the unfair competition claim, the nuisance claim does require a showing of causation.
Yeah, right. Now, I think that's going to be a big hurdle for them to get over.
Right. I mean, look, I'm just thinking of the defenses, okay? So first of all, we know they're going to attack the pleadings. So Big Food's going to attack the pleadings. There'll be either a motion to strike, demur, something to try to just throw the case out immediately. Assuming the city gets past that, I see a motion for summary judgment, dispositive motion at some point down the road, right? Assuming the city gets past that. Then I see, look, we're just following the law. The FDA doesn't outlaw any of this stuff.
Right.
They don't tell us we can't sell these things. They're the arbiter of what's safe.
Well, but we saw that, didn't we?
Yeah.
In the tobacco cases.
Right.
I mean, those were the same defenses that the tobacco cases or the tobacco industry asserted.
But I suspect we're going to see those same defenses.
Absolutely.
Right? I think that when it comes to the nuisance claim where they've got to prove causation, I think what we're going to see is arguments that, look, you can't scientifically prove that our product consumed at these levels, whatever it may be, and that'll be a fight in and of itself, is the reason that people develop diabetes and cancers and all these other things.
You mean it has nothing to do with like sedentary lifestyle like Nicole was talking about, right? I mean, look at the kids nowadays.
Or genetics.
Yeah. Genetics, kids not going outside and having a good time playing, riding bikes, scooters, they're behind.
Stress, lack of physical activity, all of those things are also factors. So I assume they're going to rely on that. Lots of money could be at stake in this thing, though.
Well, if you look at what the tobacco industry paid out, billions. I mean, hundreds of billions.
Yeah. I mean, look, if the city wins, right? So if this thing goes all the way through to a trial and the city wins, I mean, I think certainly you could see an injunction against the deceptive marketing, right? They'll no longer be able to tell you that Cheerios are healthy, I assume, would be one of the claims. I assume there'd be new warnings put on these products. I think you could see some type of an injunction as to the formulation of these ultra-processed foods to the extent that they not be as addicting or they don't cause people to just sort of endlessly consume them, right? I could see all those things happen in a win. And then on the nuisance claim, there could be major damages.
Well, I think there could be major damages, and they're not really damages, the civil penalties under the unfair business practices claim, right? What we looked at it today was $2,500 per violation.
Right.
And so I don't know, what would a violation here be?
Would it per sale, like Doritos?
Would it be per sale, per package, per chip, like per advertisement, all of those things?
Yeah. I mean, it would be very interesting because one of the other things that they could win, right, is actual abatement, meaning, hey, the state of California has had to expend X amount of dollars in Medicaid money, for example, Medi-Cal in our state, to treat people who have developed disorders related to their consumption of ultra-processed foods. We want that money back. That's no different than what the tobacco companies
It's the same exact thing they did.
Right? They had to pay for what states were spending on, frankly, treating people for things like lung cancer and emphysema and stuff like that. And so under that circumstance, we're talking about billions and billions and billions of dollars. I saw at one point the cost to abate the public nuisance for 1 year in California is $30 billion for 1 year, just in California. So you could imagine what the cost would be if this catches on nationwide. So, so to sum things up, right, we decided to talk about this today because this is an interesting case. It's something that's unusual. And because this is the first case of its kind filed in the country, it's really a bellwether case. That's what we talk about in our industry.
Right.
Meaning, if this case is successful, you could end up seeing every other state follow suit in time, right? Which is exactly what happened in the tobacco cases. And so it's an interesting case. I don't know that they're going to succeed. I frankly think they probably have a bit of an uphill battle. They have corporate interests with billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars at stake. So I suspect, there will be, this is like a full employment act for some defense attorneys for the coming years, right?
Yeah, listen, and I mean, look at it as compared to the big tobacco litigation, right? I mean, the number of defendants in this case, I think, pales in comparison to the number of defendants in the tobacco cases. And so, listen, the city attorney has his work cut out for him.
Yeah, yeah, and I think again, we've talked about this parallel with the tobacco cases throughout this podcast, but look at how long it took those tobacco cases to ultimately change things, right? You're looking at somewhere in the realm of 40 years,
Yeah,
40 plus years.
You and I may be retired by the time this is totally done.
We can be retired before this single case is done, right? I mean, that's how long these things can take. But for the whole, if this were to go the whole road of the tobacco cases, you're going to have all 50 states involved. Yeah, you're looking at potentially decades before that were to happen.
Right. By the way, we're not going anywhere soon.
Well, I hope not.
That is,
Yeah, well, I hope not. I'll tell you what I am going to do, though. When we're done with this today, I'm going to go home and I'm going to use a sleeve of Oreos.
Milk or no milk?
Oh, I'm a milk guy.
Yeah, I'm not an Oreo guy. So.
I'm a milk guy.
And I'm not a milk guy either.
I'm the worst of the worst. I am an Oreos and a whole milk guy. So, well, I'm glad Nicole has left. Otherwise, she'd be very disappointed to hear that.
Wait, wasn't her husband your friend, your childhood friend? That didn't you guys like catch a vacant lot on fire?
Oh, you got to bring that up. Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
But this statute ran, so we're good.
Statute ran a long time ago. He's not going to be happy that you brought that up. He may still have trauma from that event. I think I still have trauma from that event. So with that said, thank you all for watching. We appreciate it. Again, this is Kern Case by Case presented by Cohn Clark. If any of you have any comments, questions, things that you'd like us to bring up on a future episode, please comment. We really appreciate the feedback, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.